It was in the early autumn of 1943 that I met her. By that time she was in her 70s, white-haired, rosy-cheeked and plump, just as I'd imagined. In those days I was a young reporter, trying to make a name for myself. I'd written to her some weeks earlier, asking if I might interview her for an article I was hoping to write for the local paper. I wasn't sure how she'd react, so it was something of a surprise when she agreed to see me at her home at Castle Farm. When I told my editor that I was going to talk to an old lady named Mrs Healis about her life, he couldn't understand why I should want to, until I told him that she had another name, Beatrix Potter.
Boards present The Real Mrs Tiggy-Winkle by Suzanne Jones. Adapted for radio by Colin Lawrence.
Now, I've just made a pot of tea, Miss...
Marston. Heather Marston.
Yes, of course. Milk and sugar?
Milk. No sugar, please. Thank you.
Are you local?
Yes, Mrs Healis. I've lived in the area all my life. My parents live near Windermere.
A beautiful place. I envy you. Now, what exactly do you want to ask me about?
Well, what I have in mind is a piece about a local author, and I rather hoped you might tell me something about your life.
I see. Well, I'll try.
You live here with your husband, don't you?
William, yes.
Are you still writing?
Oh, my days of writing and illustrating children's books are long gone, young lady. In many ways, it's hard to believe, looking back, that it happened to me at all.
How do you mean?
Memories are not always sweet, you know. They can sometimes seem more like dreams than reality.
Perhaps we could start at the beginning?
Very well. I was born Helen Beatrix Potter, and was an only child until the age of 5, when my brother Bertram was born. When he was old enough, he was sent away to school.
And your family's background was?
Oh, a wealthy one. My father spent most of his days at his club when in London, and my mother either paid calls or was called upon.
How did you spend your time?
I began to paint a good deal. I was particularly interested in the countryside. The idea of a book came much later, in my 30s in fact. It started, I suppose, with a letter I'd written to the son of one of my old governesses. Miss Carter and I had become friends, but she met a young man, fell in love, and left our employ to marry and raise a family of her own. We kept in touch, of course. But while I was away in Scotland, her eldest son Noel became unwell. I wrote him a letter, which, although I didn't know it at the time, would change my life.
My dear Noel, I am not sure what to write to you, so I shall tell you a story about 4 little rabbits, whose names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank under the root of a big fir tree. Now, my dears, said old Mrs. Bunny, you may go into the field or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden.
I illustrated the letter to make it more exciting. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the first stirring which brought to life all those characters that children would later come to love down the years.
So, just that one letter started it all?
Oh, no, I didn't write only to Noel. I wrote to all the children in the family. There were stories about Mr. Jeremy Fisher, Hunker Munker, Apply Dapply, and many more. I just made up stories to please myself because, I suppose, I never really grew up.
My dear girl, you've been sitting out here in the garden for hours.
Bertram, I just can't seem to make up my mind.
But it's a lovely little book, Beatrix.
I've had it rejected several times, you know.
Then all the more reason to show some faith by publishing it yourself.
Let me tell you what I want the book to be like. I want it to be practical and simple.
Well, sounds good so far.
It has to fit small hands, you see, so it can be no more than 5 inches by 4, and printed on stout paper, and, of course, there will definitely be no baby talk, because the text will be quite as important as the pictures.
Nothing namby-pamby about it, naturally.
Naturally. Oh, I am right about this, aren't I, Bertram?
Of course you are. Look, why not just print a modest number and see how it sells? If it does well, as I'm sure it will, those short-sighted publishers who turned it down might realise what they've missed.
And so I published my very own edition. 250 copies in grey-green covers with an outline drawing of 4 little rabbits on the front.
Oh, Bertram, I'm so excited. I'm selling the book in 4s and 5s to relations and family friends. And do you know, even Conan Doyle has brought a copy for his children. Imagine that.
I'm not surprised. It's a most presentable little book, Beatrix. I'm enormously proud of you.
But that's not all. You remember that Frederick Warnes turned down my original manuscript? Well, now they're offering to publish what they refer to as my quaint little book, but with coloured illustrations throughout, rather than black and white.
Better still.
But I want to keep the price at a reasonable level so that all children can afford to buy the book.
Well, that's something you'll have to discuss with the publishers.
I'll always have a strong preference for cheap books myself, even if they don't pay. All my little friends happen to be shilling people, and I so dislike the modern fashion of giving children heaps of expensive things which they don't look at twice.
Be sure to tell the publishers how you feel when you discuss this new edition with them. You're going to be a sought-after lady, I can tell.
And how did the publishers react, Mrs. Heelis?
They were most receptive. It was the beginning of a long correspondence with Norman Warne, the youngest son of the publishing firm.
I take it he was helpful then?
Oh, why, yes. He wrote to me in the politest and most friendly terms, with constructive criticism and advice, which, more often than not, I took.
Dear Sirs, you were quite right to reject the drawings of Mr. McGregor. I've unfortunately always been very bad at drawing the human form. My brother is sarcastic about the figures, and what you and he take for Mr. McGregor's nose was in fact intended for his ear and not his nose at all. I have difficulties too with the rabbits, because my dear old Peter of the original drawings died just as I began the new illustrations. He was 9 years old, and I miss him greatly. I do have another young rabbit, but the drawings still look wrong. I am sorry to have made such a muddle of them.
Just before the Warne edition of Peter Rabbit was due to be published, I started a second project.
Which was?
The Taylor of Gloucester. As soon as it was ready, I sent a copy to Norman. It was a story I'd written for Frida Moore, Noel's sister.
My dear Frida, because you are fond of fairy tales and you have been ill, I have made you a story all for yourself. A new one that nobody has read before. And the queerest thing about it is that I heard it in Gloucestershire. That it's true. At least about the tailor.
Dear Miss Potter, we are certainly interested in publishing The Taylor of Gloucester, with some changes of course, and we're also interested in the little squirrel book you speak of. Perhaps you will call in and see us, and we could discuss it further. We are, yours sincerely, Frederick Warne & Co.
Dear Sir, I have to apologise for not having answered your letter, and I regret that I am unable to call at the office before leaving town. I should not have mentioned the subject of another book at present. I have had such a painful unpleasantness about the work at home this winter that I should like a rest from scolding while I am away. I should be obliged if you will kindly say no more about a new book at present. I remain, Sir, yours faithfully, Beatrix Potter.
While I was on holiday in Derwentwater, I received a handsome cheque from Norman Warne. I remember saying at the time that it seemed a great deal of money for such little books.
You were surprised by their success, then?
Yes, I was. I was also pleased to feel that I could earn my own living.
Dear Norman, this is a secret between ourselves. I have bought a small plot of land in Surrey. Indeed, it is so small I could go round it with a tape measure. It gives me such pleasure to know that I have a small piece of this part of the world that I have come to love so much. When the time comes for telling my parents, it will have to be put to them that it is a sound business investment and nothing to do with my desire for independence. I have bought a new rabbit who is full of spirit and energy, and although he's not Peter Rabbit, I think he might make his appearance in a story, calling himself Benjamin Bunny.
I was becoming increasingly friendly with Norman, and I'd even been brave enough to seek permission from my parents to visit his family.
I'm so glad you could come, Beatrix. I think you'll find this chair comfortable.
Thank you, Norman.
It's a shame you felt you could only come to the office and not to Bedford Square to see the whole family. They all love you so much and the children adore you, and I hope it goes without saying that I value your friendship and company.
There's nowhere else I would rather be. It's so different to my life at home in Bolton Gardens. I'm afraid, though, that these pleasant visits may not continue for much longer.
But why, Beatrix?
My parents. They're very much against our friendship.
I'm sorry. I had no idea.
Don't misunderstand me, Norman. They don't mean to be cruel or unkind, but they sometimes misguidedly cause me grief by trying to do what's right and proper and what they feel is best for me.
I see.
But let's not think of that now. Let's just enjoy today.
Very well. Do you remember that rather elaborate doll's house I made for my nieces and nephews? You remarked upon it at the time.
Yes, I do. It was lovely.
Well, I thought that if I made one for you on a small scale, with a glass side, you could keep some of your little pets in it, and watch them keep house and study them for your drawings.
Oh, Norman, that would be delightful. I'll keep my mice in it, and watch and draw them, and make up a new story for you to publish. I shall call it The Tale of Two Bad Mice.
Within a few weeks, Norman had made my doll's house, and there arrived from Hamleys a box of doll's house food and furniture. I started work on The Tale of Two Bad Mice.
I received the parcel from Hamleys this morning. The things will all do beautifully. The ham's appearance is enough to cause indigestion. I am getting almost more treasures than I can squeeze into one little book. The little dishes are so pretty, I am now wondering if I have made enough of them. Shall I squeeze in another dish? I regret the roast duck being left out.
Did your parents' views change about your friendship with Norman?
I'm afraid not. We tried to keep our spirits up despite their fierce opposition. We wrote to each other nearly every day.
Did your parents know?
It didn't escape my mother's notice. The atmosphere at home was very unpleasant at times, and there was no doubt about the fact that my parents thought of Norman as someone who wasn't of our station in life. During the first half of 1905, The Tale of Mrs Tiggy-Winkle was nearly finished. I dreaded leaving London and Norman to go on my annual holidays with my parents without some new project to work on.
Did things at home improve?
No, but something happened which prompted me to write to Norman in a very distressing vein.
Dear Norman, before leaving to go to Wales, I was silly enough to let Hunca Munca do her acrobatics from the chandelier in the doll's house, and I cannot forgive myself for letting her tumble. She died in my hands about 10 minutes later. I think if I had broken my own neck it would have saved a deal of trouble. I do miss her.
It was on that desperate note that I began my holiday in Wales. It was there that I received a letter I'd long been waiting for and had thought I'd never receive. A proposal of marriage.
Dearest Beatrix, I am, like you, a shy person, and find writing to ask if you will be my wife far easier than speaking of it in your presence. I love you very dearly and with all my heart, and I think that you feel the same. Please write and let me know what you decide. Always yours, Norman. P.S. I have sent a ring as a token, which I dare to hope you will wear.
Dearest Norman, I can think of nothing that would give me greater happiness than to become your wife. I shall wear the ring you have sent me, and despite any opposition, I shall consider myself betrothed from now onwards. Please accept the ring I have sent as my token to you. I long to see and be with you and yours in Bedford Square. With love, Beatrix.
Dearest Beatrix, everyone at home could not be happier. My nieces have been informed and are so pleased that they have asked me to tell you that from now on you are no longer to be known as Miss Potter, but as Auntie B.
How did your parents react to your engagement?
Oh, they ignored it completely. And there being no official announcements, life at home was almost unbearable. I threw myself very much into my work. The only happiness I had was in my brief visits to Bedford Square with the Warren family, who were so kind to me. And then suddenly, Norman, who'd never been very strong, became ill.
What happened?
Well, after persuading him to see a doctor, it was diagnosed that he was in the advanced stages of leukemia. He died in August.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mrs Tiggy-Winkle, the book he'd helped so much with, was in the shops and was a great success. Sadly, Norman hadn't lived to share it with me.
But you carried on?
Yes, but quite how I'll never know. Our engagement was known by hardly anyone, and both that and his untimely death went totally ignored in my own house. I wrote to Millie, Norman's sister, after the funeral.
Dear Millie, I am sending you a copy of the sketch I did the last evening in the barley field at Llanbedr. It was there that Norman's proposal reached me. I try to think of the golden sheaves and the harvest. He did not live long, but he fulfilled a useful and happy life. I must try to make a fresh beginning next year.
It must have been difficult for you.
It was. But one bright spot was on my horizon. The sale of a beautiful old farm called Hilltop in Surrey. I lost no time in buying it.
And moved in?
For holidays only. There was no possibility of my living there alone for any length of time, so I took on a farm manager to care for it in my absence.
Dear Millie, my offer to John Cannon to manage my farm was taken up gratefully, and I believe we shall get on tolerably well together. He is going to act as my agent in cattle sales and the like, and generally build up stock on the farm. When I am in Surrey and unable to stay at the farm because of the Cannons being in residence, I shall board with the blacksmith and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Satterthwaite.
And how did you adapt to your new surroundings?
I became obsessed with Surrey and its people. I wanted it to be my home, my people. I published another small book called The Pie and the Patty Pan, in which Surrey was the source of all the illustrations.
Did the local people show interest in the book?
Oh, why, yes. Everyone in the village was waiting for the book to be published. They wanted to see all those familiar things actually in print. I snatched every available excuse to get away from my parents to go to Sawrey.
Dear Milly, here I am, back at Sawrey again as soon as I was able to escape. It is fine here at last. Regular autumn weather with heavy dew at night and gossamer all over the grass in the morning. I am feeling a bit knocked about as I brought back a cold from Wales.
I was in constant touch with Milly. She became my lifeline and a voice of sanity in the lonely world I travelled with my parents. I'd recently added a small wing to Hilltop for the Canons, while I made some improvement to the main farmhouse. I was gradually making it ready to move into as a home of my own.
Dearest Milly, I have bought another farm within sight of Hilltop, called Castle Farm. The purchase was made through a most agreeable firm of solicitors, W. Heelis and Sons. The partner, Mr. William Heelis, dealt with my purchase, and he has been most helpful. He was born and brought up in Appleby, and has been keeping me up to date with the goings-on in Sawrey whilst I am away. He has a great love of the countryside, and likes nothing better than to walk and fish. I must admit that his letters have kept me cheerful through this bout of influenza and my banishment in London.
By this time, my parents were growing harder to please. They were getting old, and I was finding it difficult to be the dutiful daughter. My father's health wasn't good, and I felt obliged to be at home for most of the time. But other things were happening to brighten up my days. I had some correspondence with a certain Mrs. Garnett, who wrote to say that she'd made a frieze for her nursery out of Peter Rabbit. It was so popular that she'd like to show it to a paper manufacturer, and she wanted to know if I'd object to it being printed.
What did you think of that?
Actually, I thought it would make a very popular nursery paper. The thought of badly drawn rabbits worried me. Warne spoke to Mrs. Garnett and then submitted some drawings to Sanderson's, who said that they thought the designs weren't modern enough.
Not modern enough?
I had no idea what they meant. But they produced a frieze that sold quite well, and the royalties, though small, added things to my precious Hilltop. William Heelis was very helpful with putting in water supply to Castle Farm and 100 other tasks. I wanted so much to return to Sawrey and shake the dust of London off my feet, and I also wanted to see William.
So you came back?
Yes, and William asked me to marry him. I knew that when I said that I wished to accept his proposal, opposition at home would be as fierce as it had been 10 years earlier on my engagement to Norman.
And was it?
Yes, it was. But eventually they relented. And then the strangest thing happened. It was all to do with my brother Bertram. He was being pressed into a discussion on the subject of my engagement to William when he blithely announced that he was married himself, and had been for some years, to a local farmer's daughter, and that they lived happily on his farm in Scotland.
Really? And your parents had no knowledge of this?
They'd always thought that he lived alone. Needless to say, they were struck speechless, if that were possible, and so, unwittingly, Bertram won the day for me.
Hello, dear.
William! I didn't realise the time. I've been talking so much to Miss Marston here that I quite lost track of things. Miss Marston? My husband, William Heelis.
Oh, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. May I join you?
Of course.
Well now, how far have you got in your story, Beatrix?
To the very best part, the part where I married you.
And to my mind it wasn't a day too soon. Beatrix took to married life like a duck to water, Miss Marston.
I told Milly Warne that I felt as if I'd been married for years.
How did married life affect your work as a writer, Mrs. Heelis?
Oh, I wanted nothing more to do with writing or painting. I was only interested in being a wife and farmer. I think the people here see me as rather eccentric, don't you, William?
What if they do? Miss Marston, my wife took on the hard work of the farming with such happiness. It was a joy to watch.
I remember someone remarking many years ago that they were surprised to learn that I'd not been born here. I told them it had been merely a mistake.
Oh, Beatrix was quite alarmed when she realised she'd become something of a celebrity. All those day trippers and tourists who arrived at the gate with letters of introduction and the like.
I take it that the differences with your parents had been resolved by this time, Mrs. Healis?
I like to think so, yes. Sadly, though, just before the end of the Great War, Bertram died. Although we'd not managed to see much of each other, we wrote often, and I found his loss hard to accept. Then poor father died. He was, 81. Mother decided to move nearer to us and take a house in Sorey so she'd not be quite so alone.
And by that time we'd added another to our 2 farms, a much larger one called Troutbeck.
Luckily, as I'd married into a firm of respectable solicitors, their services came at a very reasonable rate.
When exactly was it that you moved here to Castle Farm?
Shortly after we married. I must say that the years seem to have raced by, haven't they, dear?
Yes, they have.
We kept Hilltop, of course, as a special place and private refuge for Beatrix.
I love to stroll up to Hilltop of an evening. To walk out on the hills in the dusk is always a joy to me. In fact, young lady, I rather think it's time for my walk. Would you care to come along as far as the gate?
Oh, yes, I'd be glad to. And thank you both for sparing me the time for this interview. I know how busy you are and how you dislike any publicity, so I'm really most grateful.
I've enjoyed our little chat.
Here's your coat, dear.
Thank you, William. I won't be too long. Come along, Miss Marston.
Goodbye, Miss Marston. And make sure that it's a good piece you write about my wife. She's a very special lady, you know.
I know, Mr. Healis. I know.
Dear Milly, Beatrix became ill and caught a cold, which turned into bronchitis. She was very tired and was eventually forced to remain in bed. Then a few days before Christmas, she became much worse, but insisted on writing a letter to old Joe Moscrop, our shepherd, who came at lambing and had done so for the past 16 years.
Dear Joe, still some strength in me. I write a line to shake you by the hand, for our friendship has been entirely pleasant.
Up until the last, she never forgot I was there. We'd grown together over the years, and we acted and thought as one. We couldn't have loved each other more.
I wrote my article. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet that fascinating lady again. Beatrix Potter died on the 22nd of December 1943, at the age of 77. But she'll live on forever in the hearts and minds of children everywhere, in her little books.
In The Real Mrs Tiggy-Winkle by Suzanne Jones, Heather Marston was played by Caroline Harbord, Mrs Healis by Helen McCullum, and Beatrix Potter by Suzanne Jones. Bertram was played by Guy Holmes, Norman Warren by Gregory Burke, and William Healis by Nick Warburton. The play was produced and directed by Colin Lawrence and was a board production.